CNBC.com says the U.S. Army is struggling to find the recruits it needs to win the fight over the future. The U.S. Army fell short of its 2022 recruitment goal by 25% and recently cut its projection for its total force for this year by 10,000. And they said that it's becoming harder for the military to compete for recruits. And this is a big issue. Folks are considering this to be a problem for the maintenance of what people expect from the military. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, that's an important question, and I wish more people would ask it. I think people need to remember something, that historically armies depend upon able-bodied, physically fit, mentally competent young men between the ages of 18 and 30 to survive. That's the lifeblood of any army, because those are the people that are going to go out and fight and win the battles and the wars that you're inevitably going to end up fighting in. This is something we've lost sight of. And if you're a young man between the ages of 18 and 30, single, healthy, you're looking at the military as a potential profession or simply a place where you can serve your country for some period of time, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever it turns out to be. You see that the military is saying, well, we really love all of these people who are different, transgender, whatever particular brand of LGBTQ you want to talk about. And the average young man says, well, wait a minute, where do I fit in? And then the Army recruiter tells you, well, this little girl over here who's 18, 19, 20, weighs about 120 pounds. If she can do everything you can do, there's no difference between you and her. You're exactly the same. See, we've made her a combat soldier. Well, then the young man says, well, look, if that's what you want, and that is what you think can do all of the things that I personally know in my gut cannot be done by her, well, then I guess you don't need me in the Army. And so the result is that you've got an enormous problem with trying to find people that will join the force. Now, one of the other excuses that's given is that, well, a lot of people aren't healthy. Some people have records with the police and all this sort of business. Look, I served for 28 years in the Army, and I can tell you some of the best soldiers that served with me in my 28 years were actually people that had done some time. I'll be frank with you. We're not talking about serial murderers or perverts or rapists, but people do from time to time get into trouble with the police. That doesn't mean that they're incapable of being good soldiers. So I think we've got a huge problem with image, a huge problem with, why should I join this organization? It doesn't seem to be interested in being special, in being a hard-charging, hard-fighting organization. And so people won't show up.
Yeah, there's a lot of folks saying that maybe they've gone too far in their attempt to purge folks who they consider to be extremists. There's also the mandates. That's a big component of this, would you say? The vaccine mandates?
Of course, and you know as well as I do that extreme is whatever the current administration tells you is extreme.
Right.
If you tell someone, well, I'm a Christian, I go to church every Sunday, and I have certain tasks I want to perform, I want to teach Sunday school or something else, well, this man's obviously an extremist by definition, if that's the definition of the day. So I think that's part of it. I talked to a young sailor who was getting out of the Navy because he said the church he belonged to had been listed as an extremist organization. And he said, sir, I've been going to that church since I was a child. I've never seen anything extreme about it, unless being extreme means that you're trying to be a good human being.
Right. So if that's what they're calling extremists, who is it that's setting this policy? Is it the HR department in the Pentagon? How does that work?
Oh, no. This starts at the top. This starts in the White House. It's supported by the Congress, and remember who controls Congress. And the appointees, the political appointees who are sent over there to make sure that these policies are implemented. And then, of course, you've got this whole problem with affirmative action on steroids now. This thing called equity, which is supposed to punish people because they're not the member of a special group. Special groups may be African Americans, they may be Native Americans, whatever the administration says. So the whole notion of a meritocracy is dead. And one of the things that used to attract people into the military was they thought that this was a clean slate. This is where you could go in, and based on your demonstrated character, competence, and brains, you could actually get somewhere and achieve something. And now the perception is no. I'm going to be punished for who I am or what I think, and people walk away from it.
Right. Yeah, it's a
and by the way,
entity.
all of this in the middle of a crisis or a conflict, where people in Washington are actually considering seriously using U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine. Well, if you can't even maintain the strength of your current army, which is only supposed to be about 480,000, 485,000, if you can't maintain that, you're down to, say, 460,000 or 470,000. You could be drawn into a fight in Ukraine, which I think is insane. But if we were to send forces over there, you have to reckon with the experience of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have had, truthfully, over 100,000 men killed since this business began 7 months ago, or almost 8, and they've got 300,000 or 400,000 wounded. Well, if you look at those numbers, it's not hard to figure out that that's almost the size of the United States Army. So who are we kidding? This is pure insanity.
I saw that Darren Beatty, who runs Revolver.news, a news aggregator site, he shared a comment that he said that kind of set the tone for what people are talking about. It says, Eric Stryker is reporting that the U.S. military is offering white nationalist ex-soldiers a chance to come back. And it says, this must be absolutely rough behind the scenes. It says, here's a scoop. A man I know who was discharged from the military, harassed by the FBI for being a neo-Nazi 3 years ago, was contacted by a warrant officer the other day begging him to re-enlist in exchange for $30,000 and a complete wipe of his record. If he took the deal, he was asked to close all of his internet activity down and sign an NDA to not reveal this. I mean, I don't know. It's just a rumor, but I mean, what is that something that people?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, right now we are actually through NATO paying for ISIS fighters and Al Qaeda members in northeast Syria to go to Ukraine and fight for Ukraine against the Russians.
They're still on the I didn't know they were still on the dole. ISIS is still on the dole?
Yeah, well, there's 70 of them apparently are now in Ukraine, and they're being handsomely paid to go there and try to kill Orthodox Christian Russians on behalf of Orthodox Christian Ukrainians. I mean, this is.
I thought Trump said he. Wait a second. I thought Trump said that he wiped out all of ISIS. I don't. They get him back again.
Well, I think people lose sight of the fact that Mr. Erdogan in Turkey did everything in his power to rescue as many of those people as possible, so that he could repurpose them and use them in a different setting. And Erdogan in Turkey was providing all the intelligence and a lot of the support to stand up ISIS to begin with, because its real purpose was to drive the Iranians and the Shiites out of Iraq. But this Frankenstein's monster got out of control, obviously. The people that killed more of them than anybody else are the Russians in Syria, in support of Mr. Assad's regime, which we foolishly have been trying to destroy now for years. But, the bottom line is, I suppose anything is possible. And just bear in mind, this word extremist is tossed around, and you really don't know specifically what that person did or didn't do just because the administration decided to brand him as something. I mean, you can be branded a religious fanatic, a white nationalist, a white supremacist for all sorts of bizarre reasons. Someone can report you and say you said something. Someone can put something on the internet and claim that you did it. This is the sort of sick environment that has grown up in the military. It's a disaster. It destroys morale, undermines discipline. It's the worst possible outcome. And then, of course, you can turn around and be something else that the administration says it likes, and then suddenly it doesn't make any difference what you do.
Yeah, it's totally chaotic right now. I mean, I wanted to get your take too. I saw this in Revolver News. It says, busted, Biden's Minister of Truth, Nina Jankowicz, participated in a secret NATO-funded cabal to subvert Western democracies using disinformation as cover. Now, I've seen Tucker Carlson report on this report and others, but it's a long story, and I don't know if you've seen it, but the point is that there's this whole group called the Integrity Initiative Defending Democracy Against Disinformation, and it's an organization that it's got funding, operation, I'm reading from the article now, operation structure and rhetoric that has been used to basically create a hornet's nest of NGOs, journalists, national security bureaucrats who work secretly and in concert to wage psychological warfare against citizens of the West. And they use this ploy of, we're just trying to fight disinfo, as their excuse for basically coordinating these attacks against people. Probably you're probably one of the targets of whatever this network is.
Well, first of all, you're correct. And this group really evolved in response to the 9/11 incident. And it came into existence really under the Bush administration in a primitive form. And it was designed to mobilize the population against this mythical thing called the global caliphate. I'm sure you'll remember people talking about that. I mean, for years, the global caliphate was, positioned to take over the world and enslave everyone, destroy everyone. Suddenly, the global caliphate was replaced by China, and then shortly thereafter, Russia. Well, this is a psychological operations approach to shaping information and messaging. And that's why whenever you turn on the mainstream television, go to the internet, cable television, 9 times out of 10, you're going to listen to somebody, usually a retired general who is part of this larger PSYOP, or some other former official or current official, or a journalist or something telling you, well, the Ukrainians are winning. And I sat there the other day and I began laughing because I said, since 24 February, the Ukrainians are winning. And after all of these casualties and the loss of all of this equipment that has disappeared either through criminality or, frankly, being destroyed by the Russians, suddenly the Ukrainians need more and they don't have enough people to fight. But they're winning. And the Russians, they're losing. They're running away, which, of course, is absurd. The exact opposite is the case. But it's all part of this PSYOP. It's all designed to push the nation in a particular direction. And that's very important in Europe as well as here, to push us into a belief system that is ultimately antithetical to our interests, that is counter to the values of Western Christian culture and civilization. That's what we're up against. And so we're now fighting tooth and nail, or want to, against the Russians. We have a proxy war going. But there are now these very dumb ideas floating around about, well, we could send our forces in, as Petraeus noted the other day, as part of a coalition of the willing. Well, if you're part of the NATO alliance, why do you need a coalition of the willing? Well, if NATO feels strongly enough that it should intervene in Ukraine, why hasn't there been a vote? Why hasn't the NATO Council said we are all in agreement? We should intervene in Ukraine and stop the Russians from destroying Ukraine. Well, nobody will do that because most of NATO wants nothing to do with the idea. So now we're talking about a coalition of the willing, which looks like Poles and Romanians. They seem to be the only ones who are willing to risk crossing into Western Ukraine with U.S. forces and being attacked by the Russians for doing so. I mean, it's a very strange situation. And again, why are we so anxious to form this coalition of the willing and intervene in Western Ukraine in support of the Ukrainians if the Ukrainians are winning? They certainly wouldn't need any help or assistance, would they?
So you're suggesting that the Washington has signaled an interest to create this coalition and directly bring military action in Ukraine, even without the excuse of nuclear strike from Russia?
Well, they've been trying to fabricate this notion that the Russians want to use nuclear weapons. Nothing could be further from the truth. And Putin has consistently made it clear that weapons of that nature will only be used in a retaliatory fashion. In other words, unless they are attacked with a nuclear weapon, they will not use a nuclear weapon. And I can tell you that we know the indicators. There's no evidence that any nuclear weapons have been readied for use in that country. So this is a fabrication. And in truth, my greatest concern is that if we were to send forces into Western Ukraine and they were to be destroyed, which I think is almost a certainty if we were to do this, then people in Washington would say, well, we can't afford to be seen as losing, so we're going to have to strike back. And somebody will say, well, with what? We have nothing more to send. And how do we get across the Atlantic with all the Russian submarines in the Atlantic? What are we going to do? And so he said, well, we'll use a nuclear weapon. This is my fear, not that the Russians would do anything of the kind. They won't. And by the way, would we use a nuclear weapon in close proximity to Brownsville, Texas, right across the border from Texas? Of course not, because nuclear weapons produce blast heat and radiation. They extend for tens of miles, sometimes hundreds of miles in their effects. We don't know what the wind, current prevailing winds are down in Texas, but my point is we would never risk such a thing that close to our own border. And that's also true for the Russians. So the notion that they would use this is crazy. On the other hand, the Ukrainians would love to have a nuclear weapon because they're desperate. They're losing. And that's why you've heard these rumors about a dirty bomb. I don't know if they're accurate or not, but the Russians are certainly concerned about it, which is reasonable because you can use spent fuel, in other words, uranium that is being used in a conventional reactor, couple it with conventional explosives and cause an area to become irradiated, which means people will develop radiation sickness. You can destroy crops. You can ruin the water supply. You do a lot of damage within a restricted area, and you can create the illusion that a real nuclear weapon is being used. It takes some time for people to sort out, no, it wasn't, because it's not a plutonium bomb. In other words, it's not enriched to weapons-grade use. So the bottom line is that's not going to happen. But if we were to go in there with our forces and put them at risk and they were destroyed, I do worry about the attitude of people in Washington, because you're talking about people who have made terrible, terrible strategic mistakes to this point, David. And stop and think about it. They decided that Russia was weak, economically backward, its military was ineffective, and it could be destroyed through a proxy war. What they discovered was that Russia has an abundance of resources, most important of which is food and fuel, and that Russia is in a position to shut off the fuel to Europe, the energy to Europe, and the food that would go to Europe, along with a whole host of other things, metals, minerals, and so forth. Russia is virtually self-sufficient. Europe is not. So we've put our allies in a terrible condition. And there are demonstrations today all over Europe happening as we're speaking. In fact, in Romania, there was an enormous demonstration over the weekend against the presence of U.S. forces in Romania and any plan to go to war with Russia. And there were similar demonstrations in other countries. The point is, we've made terrible strategic decisions, and we keep reinforcing the dumb decision by doubling down on the bad policy, which is unnecessary. And the consequences for this could be disastrous if we reinforce it with conventional ground forces.
Yeah, and yet there's no Democrats to join the small group of Republicans in pushing back on this war drum warfare hysteria. The Progressive Caucus, whatever that joke is, they said, we're not going to do anything to stop this. We're going to roll over. We're not going to fight against the war machine. I mean, they've become Dick Cheney and drag the Democratic Party.
Well, remember, that's true, and that's part of the corruption that lurks in the background of everything, because we're also talking about the movement of vast quantities of cash that go from the Hill to the Pentagon to the defense industries and other contractors that are involved in supporting the Ukrainians. And that results in campaign donations and various other ways to legally transfer cash to the Hill. So that's part of the problem. And the other thing is, remember that you've got progressive Republicans. We call them rhinos. They're just Democrats in Republican clothing. Most of the worst of it are in the Senate. I mean, just go down the list of the people who are senators from the Republican Party, and how many are you going to find that have raised objections to the policies? Rand Paul? Absolutely. Mike Lee, some of the time. Who else? What about those that swing the big axe on the Hill? Mitchell, Inhofe, Cruz, Portman, Johnson. I guess Portman's going to go away at the moment, and Johnson may or may not be reelected. But the bottom line is that these Republicans might as well be Democrats. And all of this against the backdrop of our open borders. Open borders, letting millions of people in. We don't know anything about them. We don't know where they're going to end up. But we do know, based on previous experience, that in many states they'll end up voting in elections, whether they're citizens or not. It's horrible. And then we know a lot of them are criminals. And we know that this is human trafficking bound up with the fentanyl disaster. And 100,000 Americans died from fentanyl poisoning last year. I mean, that's as many Ukrainians as have died in the war in the last 7.5 months. Is anybody raising any objections to the commitment of U.S. forces on the ground in Ukraine? Has anybody asked, why aren't we sending these forces, the 101st, to the border with Mexico? The 101st would be a great unit to send to the border because of their air mobility and the large quantities of combat infantry. Ideal for that job. So why aren't we protecting our borders? How many Republicans are standing up and asking that question?
And meanwhile, like you said, there seems to be more and more inching closer and closer to direct military involvement in America in Ukraine. So what would that look like? I mean, you talked about in the American Conservative piece the need to do War Powers Act for Congress to invoke that act. But is this something that if America was to officially bring in a coalition and be directly involved with troops on the ground in Ukraine, would Russia get more aggressive in Ukraine on the battlefield, or would they stand back and recalibrate what they're going to do?
Well, right now we know that there is an enormous Russian buildup going on behind the lines down in southern Ukraine, in western Russia, and in Belarus to the north. We know that probably by mid-November you'll have roughly 700,000 Russian troops in the theater. And remember that up until this point in time, only about 20% of the Russian ground force and the Russian army has ever been used. So we're talking about 80,000 combat troops on any given day fighting in Ukraine. Now we're going up to 700,000. And we're talking about enormous quantities of missile and rocket batteries, all the support mechanisms for successful combat. And they all operate within a highly effective integrated air defense system. And contrary to what people have been saying about the Russian Air Force has flown over 70,000 sorties in support of the Russian army in Ukraine to this point. And they're moving in additional bombers and additional fighter bombers, as well as, vast quantities of loitering munitions and unmanned systems. This is going to be unleashed in mid-November. And the goal is to end this war, period, to crush what remains of the Ukrainian forces and end it, because no one will negotiate with Moscow. So Moscow has no choice. If no one will talk to us, if no one is willing to negotiate, then we've got to end it on terms that are favorable to us that will preserve our national security. Now, in the midst of this, we have people talking about committing U.S., Polish, and Romanian forces together, presumably. I'm guessing because the Poles are the only ones that really want to fight the Russians at this stage. And that's disastrous because we don't have the depth in the force. We're not ready to go in there. We're not protected by a very highly integrated air and missile defense system. It's a very dangerous thing to do, and I think people are making false assumptions about the Russians. They're saying, they're not really very good. They'll be intimidated by us. We can bully them. I think they're dead wrong, and I don't understand why they haven't figured that out at this point.
Yeah, it's quite a disturbing situation we find ourselves into, and I don't understand how anybody in D.C. doesn't seem to have a cooler head to be able to say, let's stop this. I think we've done enough here. This is getting to a point. They don't seem to understand the word enough in that town. It's just completely blinded by its own error.